คุณ Jason Hilling Arbor Regional Director South Asia Please welcome Mr. Jason Hilling Arbor Regional Director South Asia to talk with us about this next topic
Thank you All right good morning good afternoon I love to be the one who stands between you and lunch So I promise I'll make it interesting because I know all of you guys are probably hungry, sitting down, watching presentations all day. All right, so let's begin. Every good story always begins with a bad guy, a protagonist, right? Somebody who's out there trying to cause problems, wreak havoc, and that's really what we're talking about today. We're talking about a story about Internet of Things devices and how those devices can be used against you. And there's some common terminology that we all need to have in order to make sure that today's conversation is productive. So I know some of this might be a little bit basic for you, but I want to set the stage really quickly just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So we're going to cover two very, very basic topics. And the first is, what is a botnet? Okay? What I want you to think about with a botnet is a bunch of infected devices, devices that have bad software on them. Usually the owners of those devices don't know their devices are infected. So this might be, for example, your laptop computer. It might be your desktop computer. It might be your mobile phone. And in the case of IoT, it might be a web camera, an IP camera, a router, or even something like an automobile. These infected devices are part of what's called a botnet because they receive instructions from somebody known as a bot master. And the bot master you can think of as a puppet master. You can think of somebody holding the strings of a marionette puppet, moving the puppet around. The bot master is basically using what's called a command and control server to send instructions to its bot army, its army of infected hosts. So the bot master or the puppet master uses the command and control server to send instructions to all the infected devices. And thus you have a botnet that is basically an army for hire. This army for hire can be used to launch denial of service attacks. It can be used to wreak all sorts of different types of havoc on the internet. So that leads us to, what is a DDoS attack? DDoS stands for Distributed Denial of Service. Okay? In this diagram that I have here, you can see that you have routers, you have computers, and all of them are transmitting data, the green lines, in a normal fashion. Everything is working really well. But then, let's say that some of the devices on that network become infected. They become infected with malware. Maybe the users browsed a website that caused their machine to get infected. Maybe they took a USB stick with malware on it and put it into their computer. Okay? Maybe their device was remotely scanned and compromised automatically without the user having any awareness at all. Once that happens, these infections then result in the devices receiving command and control instructions from the bot master to launch an attack. And that becomes a DDoS attack. A DDoS attack is a distributed denial of service attack. The goal of a DDoS is to flood huge amounts of traffic to take down somebody's internet access, to deny services. If you want a real-world analogy of a DDoS attack, imagine Bangkok traffic. When you're sitting in traffic and you've got too many cars on the road and you're not going anywhere at all, that's almost like a real-world example of a DDoS attack. DDoS attacks are the internet's version of a busy signal. If you pick up your phone and you call somebody who's already on another call, you usually get a busy signal. That's what happens when a DDoS attack is underway. So these DDoS attacks, they have huge impacts on organizations, on governments, and on the stability of the internet itself. And there's probably no better example of what the impacts of one of these attacks can be than what we saw recently when the Dyn attacks occurred. You guys probably all heard about the Dyn attacks in the news. Dyn is a DNS provider, an authoritative DNS provider. And recently, Dyn was attacked by a very, very large-scale distributed denial of service attack. And that Dyn attack was launched by a very specific botnet called the Mirai Botnet. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Mirai Botnet as we go through the conversation today. But the Dyn attack created an unprecedented circumstance. It caused huge commercial properties on the internet to become unavailable. Big names like Twitter, Reddit, and so forth were literally taken right off the internet. When somebody wanted to go book a property at Airbnb, there was no Airbnb to connect to. It was gone from the internet during this particular outage. So Dyn brought huge visibility to the reality of what can an IoT attack mean for my business? What can it mean for the stability of my nation's internet? Dyn brought all of that to the forefront, and that's why I've chosen to highlight it here as an example of kind of the poster child for what a distributed denial of service based on IoT can actually result in. So, my name is Jason Hilling. I take care of the South Asia region for Arbor Networks. And what I want to talk to you guys about today is I want to talk to you a little bit about how these IoT botnets are actually impacting the state of DDoS. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how tools for DDoS attacks are becoming very readily available and how the weaponization of those tools is increasing the risk that we all face on a daily basis. I'm also going to share with you some statistics, some real-world statistics of what's happening globally, as well as what's actually happening in Thailand over the last couple months, so that you guys have some visibility into the real scope of this problem. And then I'm going to give you some very practical examples on what organizations can do to minimize their potential risk of dealing with DDoS-related attacks. So that's the journey we have ahead of us. So just to give you a quick heads up on who Arbor is and where some of the data is that we're going to present today. So Arbor is a company that has been in the anti-DDoS and network visibility business back to the year 2000. And one of the things that separates Arbor from a lot of others in the industry is research. We have our own research organization called ACERT. And ACERT has an intelligence network that they've built called Atlas. And Atlas is actually one of the world's largest intelligence networks today. It monitors roughly 130 terabits per second of network traffic, which is roughly equivalent to about 1/3 of the global internet. And ACERT actually samples and analyzes nearly 200,000 malware samples every day. So the goal of ACERT is to really not just understand where are the attacks and what's happening with them, but they actually want to dig into what's the campaign behind these attacks. What does it really mean? What are the attackers trying to get out of it? And that attribution piece is a really important piece of the puzzle because it helps you to understand what's really going on. Why are the attacks occurring? So some of the data that we're going to present today actually comes out of a research report that Arbor produces on an annual basis called the Worldwide Infrastructure Security Report. And I'll give you a link to that report at the end of the discussion today. So you guys are welcome to download it. There's no cost. But it basically gives you a really clear view of not just what's happening as we see from the Atlas network, but it also gives you a clear view of what's happening in terms of organizational and operational security maturity across enterprises, government entities, and service provider organizations alike. So hopefully that information will back up a little bit of what we're going to talk about as we go through today's discussion. All right, so let's kind of dig into the meat of this. So everybody knows about the Internet of Things. I think what probably surprised most people is simply how big it's become and how prolific Internet of Things has become in our daily lives. We've gotten to the point now where we can essentially only purchase, in some cases, Internet of Things devices. There are seemingly mundane household appliances that, for whatever reason, in some ways simply because we can, we feel the need to connect to the internet so that we can collect all sorts of statistical information about the average quality of the air in my home apartment, or the temperature trends in my apartment over the course of a given day, or the exact amount of power utilization that my television uses while it's plugged in but not turned on. In reality, for the average person, none of this stuff matters. But for whatever reason, we love the idea of connecting these things, getting this data, and understanding our environment in as detailed a way as we possibly can. And so that has caused the number of IoT devices to skyrocket. Right now, every given day, roughly 5.5 million, that's million devices, are connected to the internet every day. 5.5 million new devices. The assumption is that by the year 2020, depending on whose statistics you use, there'll be somewhere between 20 and 30 billion IoT devices connected to the internet. That's many, many, many devices for every single person on Earth. Those numbers are almost staggering. They're almost hard to conceptualize just how big that is. And the challenge that we have is that the IoT devices out there, not every one of them, but many of them are incredibly vulnerable. And they're vulnerable because these devices have been designed really for one purpose: ease of use. Okay? IoT would not have taken off if it was hard to use. It's taken off because it's so darn easy to use, anybody can figure it out. Pull your air purifier out of the box, plug it in, click this button on an app, and you're connected. And off you go. It's that simple. Now, most of us are used to the idea of patching devices, right? We all have our laptops, we all have our iPads or iPhones. We apply software updates almost every day, it seems. I know my laptop bugs me every single day to install that update, that even as a security guy, I defer to the next day because I'm too busy working on that big proposal or that presentation or whatever document. So we're all familiar with this. But the reality is, when you take an Internet of Things device that usually doesn't have a screen attached to it, it doesn't really have an easy-to-access interface outside of pulling up an application, we don't really think about patching these devices. And not only do we as users not think about patching them, unfortunately, historically, the manufacturers of these devices have shown that they don't think all that much about patching them either. And so the lack of visibility, the lack of awareness, and the lack of effort to patch these things is really what has started to create the scope of this IoT botnet problem. And it's hard to think, right? 10 years ago, nobody really thought much about the idea of an internet-connected refrigerator becoming infected with a piece of malware and causing all the food in the refrigerator to spoil. Nobody thought about this stuff. We all thought about how great it would be to have an internet-connected refrigerator, but nobody thought about the security implications. Well, the reality is that IoT botnets are not actually as new as we might think. If you go back to 2003, the University of Wisconsin actually experienced a distributed denial of service attack that was one of the first IoT DDoS attacks. It was actually inadvertent, it wasn't intentional, but it was because a manufacturer of routers set their devices up and hard-coded them when they left the factory to use an NTP, or a network time protocol server, that was located at the university. So as more and more of these devices were sold, and they were plugged in and turned on, all of them went to this poor NTP server at the University of Wisconsin to get the time, and suddenly it created a denial of service condition that took their internet, the university's internet, offline. That was going all the way back to 2003, which is actually a long time ago. Then in 2008, we had a first recorded actual IoT DDoS attack. And this was based on a series of individual routers that were actually compromised with malware and launched attacks against coordinated targets. So the first instance of this threat goes all the way back to 2008. But the distinction is that when people think of IoT, they tend not to think of things like routers, consumer-oriented Wi-Fi devices. The definition that most people think about, and what's garnered this topic such attention recently, is that people tend to think of IoT devices as consumer appliances. They think of them as video cameras, air purifiers, smart scales, refrigerators, smart TVs, that sort of thing. And that's really why IoT botnets are such a big topic now, is because the number of those devices has grown substantially over the past few years, and the pace is speeding up, not actually slowing down. So if we look at what type of IoT botnet attacks and activity we're seeing today, there's a seemingly constant stream of new examples of this threat. And one of the problems is that with each new example comes a new lesson and a new revelation. And those revelations generally tend to be the attacks keep getting larger and larger and larger. If we go back to 2013, the largest DDoS attack in 2013 was around 300 gigabits per second. But then when you went to 2014, it was a 400 gig attack. Then in 2015, it was a 500 gig attack. Then when you went to 2016, the actual peak attack size is hard to put your finger on. It depends on whose data you use. Most of the data that we can measure at Arbor says the largest attack in 2016 was around 600 gigabits per second. But there are reported attacks from particular incidents that we can't verify that state that that attack size could potentially be somewhere between 800 gigabits per second to 1 terabit per second. You know, these are huge, huge numbers. These are huge numbers when you think about internet bandwidth coming into your organization that might be 100 megabits per second, 50 megabits per second. You might think of service providers who've got, gigabits of throughput total. So this is a huge revelation to see these types of traffic volumes being generated. Now, we're going to talk statistics later in the discussion, and I'll give you a picture of where Thailand sits with respect to the global landscape. But I can tell you that even a country like Thailand, which, if you look at the size of the globe, is a small country, you guys are not unnoticed. The attacks are coming to Thailand, and they are just right below the global average attack size. So you're not protected just because you're not geographically a huge country. You're still targeted because you have information-rich assets, and those are things that attackers are motivated to get to. So let's talk a little bit about why security is such a problem in the IoT domain. The reality is that the IoT vendors, as we talked about earlier, are focused on ease of use. They're not really focused on security. And actually saying they're not really focused on security is probably being a little bit too generous for many of the manufacturers. Because what's happened is that the IoT manufacturers have seemed to forget, in some cases, the last 20 years of information security. If you go back 20 years ago, boy, we've learned a lot in IT security. It shocks me when I think about how mature we've become in the last 20 years. Yet at the same time, we still find security problems haven't gone away, right? No matter how many firewalls, next-gen firewalls, web application firewalls, intrusion detection, intrusion prevention, security information event management, IDM, no matter how many technologies we deploy, we can't make the problem go away, okay? So that seems to tell you that security should be one of the core design principles of everything we do. But in the case of a lot of these IoT devices, what's happened is that these devices have actually gone out to market with unpatched versions of Linux operating systems. They've gone out with unhardened versions of Linux operating systems, which means that by unhardened, what we mean is nobody took the time to shut down things that aren't needed. So for example, unnecessary network services, old network services like ChargeN as an example, are still running on some of these IoT devices. No access control lists, so no restrictions to who can connect to them. No firewalls to block any type of inbound connections. Open services for remote access like Telnet and FTP completely exposed. All of that sounds really bad, okay? It all sounds really bad. Any security person knows that you don't do any of those things. And then it gets even worse when you tell them, and oh, by the way, they didn't bother to change the default usernames and passwords either. So literally, you've got devices that are sitting there on the public internet that have a username and password like admin ABC123, sitting there going out the factory and being installed in millions of people's networks. So if anybody ever asks you, why has IoT security become a problem and why are IoT botnets such a big thing, default usernames and passwords with no security is the short answer to that question. And the attackers are opportunistic people, okay? They are looking for the easy path. Attackers are not looking for the hard path unless they're trying to prove something, okay? So when you create a situation where you have outdated operating systems with extraneous services running on them, with default usernames and passwords, you better believe attackers are going to pay attention. They're going to get in there and do as whatever they can to compromise as many of these hosts as possible. And this graphic actually shows you the amount of telnet activity that we saw in Arbor's own systems. I don't think I can get a laser pointer here. Won't reach that far. But what you can see is, going back into 2016, you can see a huge increase by that blue chart in the amount of telnet activity. That blue chart shows you scanning activity for IoT devices. That's basically people connecting to IP addresses on telnet ports and attempting to compromise IoT devices. Just an unbelievable increase if you look at the traffic from the previous 24 months. That's the reality of the situation. So that takes us to this topic of Mirai, okay? The Mirai Botnet. Most of you have probably heard a little bit about this. We're calling Mirai Botnet the big daddy of all botnets. Right now, the Mirai Botnet has over 500,000 hosts, 500,000 members, 500,000 plus devices make up the Mirai Botnet. And then there are many variants with similar numbers, and in some cases larger. So the Mirai Botnet was originated by compromising a series of IP-based video cameras, as well as network access devices and routers. So those are the main participants in the Mirai Botnet. And the Mirai Botnet follows all the same bad rules that we talked about earlier, specifically open telnet ports, default usernames and passwords. If you right now wanted to, all by yourself, compromise a device to make it theoretically a member of the Mirai Botnet, you could actually go on Google, do a Google search, and you could find all the individual technologies that are part of the Mirai Botnet and all the default usernames and passwords today with one Google search and pull it up on a single page. That's how easy it has become. The source code for Mirai is actually open source, which has led to a whole host of Mirai-based variants that have caused the number of Mirai Botnet participants to escalate exponentially. Now, what makes the botnet interesting is that the scanning has become so significant that if you take a device and you plug it into the network, on average, that device will be compromised within 3 minutes. Think about that. 3 minutes is not even enough time to get up and grab a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, and that device has already been compromised after being plugged into the network. Now, some people might say, well, hang on, there's a silver lining. There's a good side to this, which is if you turn the device off, no problem, the infection disappears. And when you turn the device back on, it's no longer compromised. But with a 3-minute window between plugging it in and having it compromised, that's not actually very much of a savings grace at all. So let's talk a little bit about how devices get subsumed into the botnet. So basically, it's a fairly interesting process, and it actually involves a simplistic form of reconnaissance. And what makes the IoT botnet, or the Mirai botnet, interesting is that it kind of spreads like a virus. You know, you think about these models that you can find on the internet, where they talk about how infectious diseases spread. One person becomes patient 0, then they get onto an airplane and they infect 10 people who fly into 10 different countries. And then each one of those infects another person who infects another person, and the thing spreads exponentially. Next thing you know, the map is entirely red with infected people. The Mirai botnet actually spreads in very much the same way. When a host is compromised, that infected host then began scanning for other hosts to which it can infect. So the reason that you're seeing devices get compromised in just 3 minutes' time is because there's so many other devices out there that are scanning, and they're all scanning huge IP ranges, and they're doing it very, very quickly. The original authors of the Mirai botnet were also pretty smart. They set the thing up to scan broadly, but they also set it up to skip over certain network segments to try to keep themselves from getting into too much trouble. So, as an example, the original code skipped over the United States Postal Service network. It skipped over the United States Department of Defense networks. So these things were not included in the algorithm by which all of these devices were out there doing their scans. Later versions and later variants have removed some of those restrictions, and they will scan anybody and everybody and try to infect whomever they can. And because there are so many variants now, if you have an infected device, you reboot it, it comes back online, it may in fact get reinfected in 3 minutes, but it might be infected by a different variant, not the original same variant as before. So once the Mirai botnet identifies somebody that it believes it can infect, it then sends the IP address of that up to the command and control server of the botnet. The command and control server then connects to that particular device and infects it with the actual malware itself. When the malware starts running, the first thing it does is removes any other malware that's already on the device. So it makes sure that it's the only game in town and has full control of that particular asset. Then that asset then goes off and begins the process all over again. Now, all of those devices conduct their scans, but what they're really doing while they're scanning is waiting. Okay? What they're waiting for is instructions on who should they go out and attack next. Which takes us to size. Size does matter. Size is a very important attribute of DDoS. If you look at this diagram, this, and I know you can't see it because it's really small, but it has a bunch of IP addresses, okay? And our research team at ACERT will draft up these pictorial representations of botnets. And they do this to help understand and to demonstrate size and scale. This is what you see in a traditional botnet. A traditional botnet has dozens of thousands of bots. Okay? So that might mean, for example, 10,000 or 20,000 infected hosts, all waiting to follow the bid of their respective bot master. This is a comparison of a legacy botnet to an IoT botnet. All you need to understand by looking at this diagram is, wow, that's a lot of red, right? Look at how many hosts are part of it. And so there you're talking about hundreds of thousands to potentially millions of individual hosts. Okay? Now, one of the things that helps make us survive these IoT botnet attacks today is the fact that most of these IoT devices, not only are they released with the idea of being easy to use, they're also released with the idea of being relatively inexpensive for people to purchase and deploy, okay? Which means that the processing power inside these IoT devices, by the standards of your top-of-the-line smartphone, are pretty weak. The processing power in most of these IoT devices is very small. And the TCP/IP stacks inside these devices are not optimized to generate large amounts of traffic. Okay? They've been built with a purpose, which is usually to communicate small amounts of traffic about the temperature in your home or the air quality, or today you weigh 52 kilos and yesterday you weighed 51 kilos. You know, these are the types of data that these devices are intended to transmit. So when you repurpose them into a botnet and you try to scan lots of IP addresses, or you try to flood huge amounts of traffic, the devices are actually pretty inefficient at doing that. And so that means that sometimes they will lock up, sometimes they will automatically reboot themselves, and sometimes they will simply fail to generate high volumes of traffic. But that's going to change. And we know that every year, processing power increases substantially. My goodness, look at the devices you have in your hands today and compare them to a device from just 5 years ago. The results, when you look at benchmarking tools, are in a way unbelievable. And to think IoT devices are going to play out any differently would be very naive. IoT devices are going to increase their processing power significantly year on year as well, which means that as more of these devices roll out with more processing power, more optimized network stacks, the opportunity for this problem to become worse than it is today is truly substantial and significant. And so here's an example of how the IoT situation, IoT botnet attacks, have played out over the past couple years. And again, I apologize if some of it's a little tough for you to see. In 2014, we saw IoT attacks that were tied to the World Cup, about 300 gigabits per second. Okay? Then when we went over to April of 2016, this is when we started to see a large increase in attack activity that was centered around the Olympic Games in Brazil. So the attackers were actually testing their techniques. They were preparing to make a splash at the Olympic Games. They wanted to cause impact. Okay? And so what they did is they tested and tested. You can see the activity ramping up. Then things cooled down right before the actual games themselves. And then, bam, a roughly 600 gig attack was launched during those games. And you know what's significant about the attack is that it was a 600 gig attack that was not directed towards, let's take down the Olympic Games website. Let's stop people from live streaming the games. Nobody attacked anything having to do with the Olympic properties. But you know what they did attack? They attacked the financial services institutions in Brazil. This was an attack against Brazil as a country. This was an attempt to kick Brazil off the global stage. It was intended to damage the economy by preventing the tourists who had come into the country from accessing their funds. You go to the ATM, guess what? Connection denied. Sorry, we can't pull any money out now. You can't go spend any money. Try to make a credit card transaction. Sorry, the internet connection's not there. Denied. That was what the attackers were after. That was a 600 gig attack. And there were all sorts of attempts that were made by the service providers to stop that stuff from happening. And interestingly enough, you didn't hear too much about network services going down in Brazil. That's because the service providers were effective at stopping those attacks by collaborating with DDoS vendors accordingly. Then, when you move into October of 2016, you start to see some incredibly high-profile Mirai Botnet attacks. You saw an attack against Brian Krebs' security website, roughly 650 or so gigabits per second. You saw the Dyn attacks. You saw attacks against OVH, a web hosting company in France. Okay? These are some of the attacks where it's a little bit questionable how big they were. As I mentioned to you before, Arbor has an intelligence network called Atlas. We see about 1/3 of the global internet traffic. We didn't see the size attacks that were being reported here. But the rumors, as I mentioned before, were between 800 gigs all the way up to 1 terabit per second. That's enough to take pretty much any organization offline. There are very few people in the world who have facilities and infrastructure in place to be able to mitigate an attack of that size. Very, very few. So what are the motivations? Why does this keep happening? What can we really do about it? So if you think about the bad guys, I would argue that there's really 3 types of bad guys. Now you can find all sorts of models where people analyze this down, the psychology of it all, and you can get to 5, 6 different types of personas. But I'm going to boil it down and keep it simple. I'd argue there's basically 3 kinds. There's one. There's the script kiddies. These are simply the guys who are a nuisance, right? It really is somebody who's out there for nihilism purposes. Maybe they want to make a name for themselves. They're not incredibly skilled. They're not highly trained necessarily, but they're out there just trying to make some noise and gain some notoriety amongst the community in which they spend their time. So these might be online gamers attacking other gamers, okay? These sorts of things, which those gamer-to-gamer attacks were really the origins of the DDoS problem going back many, many, many years. The second type you have is the criminals. These are the people who are essentially in it for financial gains. They're out trying to make a buck. Now they're trying to make a buck either to line their own pockets, or in worst cases, they're associated with the third type, which is the cyber terrorists. And I'm also going to kind of bundle in nation-state-based attackers in there as well. And so these are the individuals that are really looking at this not necessarily as a way to reach or achieve monetary gain. These are people who are out there literally conducting cyber warfare. And there are some security professionals that will tell you we're in the midst of a cyber war right now, but can't necessarily tell you exactly what the motivations are or what the intended outcome of that war actually is. But the reality is that on an individual basis, we're seeing and we're hearing about actual nation-state-based and terroristic cyber attacks almost on a regular basis. Probably the most prolific that we've seen in the news recently is the Russian hacking attempts, or the alleged Russian hacking attempts against the United States, intruding upon the electoral process, and as some people would say, attempting to squash democracy. But this is big stuff. This is important stuff. The motivations are real, and the attackers themselves are real. So these guys are using a set of tools. And I apologize for the small pictures. I tried to compress the images in this presentation, and much like a good attacker, PowerPoint obfuscated my images by shrinking them so you can't see them. So I'm sorry about that. But what you would see if they were life-size is you'd see some screenshots of some internet services that bad guys can actually subscribe to launch DDoS attacks. Okay? So the reality is that we have stressor services that have been released out there on the internet that people can subscribe to in an organized fashion for the purposes of actually launching attacks. Now, if you ask yourself, that's interesting, somebody's running a commercial enterprise in order to execute DDoS attacks. Well, how's that happening? Well, the answer is botnets. Okay? When individual devices are subsumed into those botnets are controlled by somebody. Well, the reality is that the attackers have realized, this goes way beyond becoming a nuisance. This is a huge money-making opportunity. And so that has resulted in a lot of these services coming online that are advanced enough to the point where they actually offer 24/7 tech support, and they actually have service-level agreements about uptime and availability, as well as peak traffic volumes that can be generated through their botnets. So this is essentially a criminal enterprise is really what you're looking at. And the number of these tools and the ease with which the services can be accessed and the inexpensive rates that these services charge is what has really created this idea of weaponizing DDoS attacks. And the DDoS attacks can be weaponized to accomplish all sorts of different things, right? They can be weaponized to accomplish things like extortion, right? Where somebody actually comes in, launches an attack, and says, how'd you like that? If you don't pay me 2 Bitcoins, I'm going to launch that attack again. And there was a whole rash of these extortion attacks that took place about a year and a half ago from a group called DDoS for Bitcoin that was targeting financial service institutions here in Thailand as well as all over the world. Okay? You also have DDoS attacks that are being used as smokescreens for advanced persistent threats. And that basically means let's launch a DDoS attack, let's use that attack to get people busy running around with like their hairs on fire, and then meanwhile we're launching targeted exploits at known vulnerable systems so that we can compromise, elevate privileges, and then exfiltrate data while nobody's watching. So this weaponization of DDoS attacks has really become a significant problem that everybody's got to deal with now. And when you combine the weaponization aspect with the IoT botnet aspect and the ease with which these botnets can be created, you really have that situation of the perfect storm. That's why this problem has become such a top-of-mind topic for almost every internet-connected organization out there today. And ultimately, when people are making money off this, you have to ask yourself, where's that money going? A lot of the studies that are being conducted in this area are starting to reveal that the money from a lot of these operations, unfortunately, are going towards terrorist-type activities. And this is a evolving area of research, and obviously in any cybercrime, it's really tough to attribute who's really responsible. But when you start following the money, and of course, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin make that really difficult. But when you start following the money, unfortunately, you start to realize that that's really what is behind a lot of these activities. So now that we've kind of talked a little bit about what's happening, how it's happening, why it's happening, let's look at statistically what we're seeing globally, as well as what we're seeing here in Thailand. And before we get into those statistics, I want to talk a little bit deeper about DDoS, and I want to make sure we all level set on the types of denial of service attacks, because they actually feed into the statistics that we're going to discuss. So, at the very beginning, I kind of said, well, what's a DDoS attack? Well, it's like a traffic jam in Bangkok, or it's like a busy signal. So that refers to what we call a volumetric denial of service attack. Okay? A volumetric attack is literally huge amounts of traffic being squeezed into finite resources like an internet connection. But there are other types of denial of service attacks that are important as well. One of those is called an application layer attack. It's basically, think of it as a vulnerability exploit, and when you exploit that vulnerability on a particular server or a particular internet resource, it might cause that resource to lock up or hang up. Okay? Such as, let's say you were trying to fill out a form on the internet and you entered in some information that it wasn't expecting to receive, and you pressed enter and it locked the whole website up. That's kind of like a denial of service, and that might be equivalent to what we would call an application layer denial of service. The third type is what we call a state exhaustion attack. So some of you guys might remember going all the way back to the late 1990s when we came out with this great idea of stateful inspection. Stateful inspection is the idea of keeping track of inbound and outbound connections so that you can better apply security policy to your organization. State tables and tracking state creates an opportunity for an attacker to create a denial of service condition. Let me give you an example. Let's imagine that I have a notebook, and that's equivalent to a state table on a firewall. And I give that notebook to you, and I say, go stand by the door, and every single person that comes in and out, write down their full name and details. You're going to do that, and people are going to come in and out of the room. But when that notebook is full, nobody can leave, or nobody can enter the room. That's a state exhaustion attack. If you keep writing down connections as fast as you possibly can, but once the notebook is full, you can't write any more connections, suddenly no traffic passes in and out of that device. That's created a denial of service condition. So you've got three types of denial of service attacks. You've got volumetric attacks, the big, noisy, loud, all the traffic in Bangkok streets attacks that you hear about in the news. You've got the application layer attacks, which are the ones where somebody exploits a vulnerability. And you've got the state exhaustion attacks, where your notebook just runs out of paper. Those are the three attack types. Now, here's some statistics from our Worldwide Infrastructure Security Report on volumetric attacks. So what we did when we did the last Wizard report, which came out early this year and covered the entire calendar year of 2016, we asked organizations, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing with respect to volumetric DDoS attacks. And every year we ask those organizations the same question. And you can see in the data, look at how fast the attack sizes are ramping up in the last 5 years compared to what you saw previously. That's driven by a few different factors. Okay? It's driven by increased bandwidth. Okay? Lots of fiber to the home initiatives being rolled out globally. It's driven by number of internet accessible devices, and it's driven by the introduction of the IoT botnet problem. And so the respondents in this survey indicated that they saw attacks of up to 800 gigs last year. When we looked at the data coming out of our Atlas network, which is our intelligence network, we basically identified that there was roughly about a 600 gig peak attack size that we saw midway through 2016. So our data lines up reasonably close to the anecdotal data that we received from the survey respondents as well. But I think more important than the size of the attack is the frequency with which the attacks are actually occurring. And the statistic that I think is most telling is that if you're an enterprise or a government entity, okay, the survey data says that roughly 45% of organizations are going to receive a DDoS attack in the course of a given 12-month period. So let me say that again. Roughly 45% of organizations will see a DDoS attack in roughly a 12-month period. That's almost the equivalent of flipping a coin. Okay? So as organizations go out and they plan how do we manage risk around this particular problem, right now a lot of that mindset tends to be, well, I've never been attacked before, so I don't really need to do anything about it. I can wait until I get attacked. But of course the problem with that is that if you wait until you get your first attack, then you've allowed the attackers to complete that denial of service condition in the first place. And the other telling statistic is that roughly half of those people that will see an attack in the course of a given 12-month period are going to see attacks occur more than 10 times per month. So let me convert that statistic for you. About half the organizations will get attacked every 12 months, and about 25% of organizations will be attacked more than 10 times per month. So those are huge numbers. And you're going to see when we start looking at the Thailand data actually demonstrates this picture flawlessly. Now, what are the motivations? We've already talked about a lot of them, and I know this is a bit of an eye chart, but the basically what you see in the motivations piece is that the motivations are mostly gaming oriented. It's mostly attackers who are demonstrating their DDoS attack capabilities to prospective customers. And then it's people who are looking for monetary gain out of those attacks. Those are basically the top 3 or 4 that you see on this list. And who's being attacked? The short answer to that is almost everybody to some degree, but certain verticals, certain segments get attacked a lot more than others. So this data comes from service providers. So the various service providers globally who fed into this survey were asked, which of these types of customers do you see attacks being launched towards? Okay? And what this means is that about 70% of the service providers said they saw end user attacks being launched towards end users. About roughly half of the service providers said they saw attacks being launched towards government entities. About 40% of them said they saw financial institutions receiving attacks, and so forth. But you can see pretty much every segment is seeing some type of activity. So what this tells you is that on average, about half of all enterprise organizations will see an attack every 12 months, but your likelihood of being attacked differs a little bit depending on what sector or vertical your particular organization tends to reside in. Then the question comes in of impact, and we mentioned impact at the very beginning of the talk when we talked about Dyn, and we talked about lots of major internet properties being taken off the internet. So the impact here for most organizations in some way, shape, or form is a monetary impact, okay? And it's super hard to quantify exactly what that impact is because it's different for everybody. But the range that we saw is we saw on the low end, we saw enterprises saying downtime costs them on average about $500 a minute. So if you factor an attack that takes 10 minutes, that's about $5,000. Over the course of an hour, that's about $30,000. And over the course of 8 hours, that's $240,000 for the attack. Okay? The average attack, when you look at the statistics, I'll show it to you here. The average attack duration in Thailand, incredibly short, less than 30 minutes. That's the chart on the right-hand side. All the blue there represents less than 30 minutes. So it doesn't really sound like too big of a deal, right? If the average downtime costs $500, attacks are less than 30 minutes, do we really need to worry about it? Well, unfortunately, this chart doesn't tell the full story. Okay? The real story is that attackers tend to launch what we call multi-vector attacks, which means they launch different types of attacks, sometimes in parallel and sometimes in serial, one after another. So just because this particular attack type only lasts 30 minutes doesn't mean at the same time there's not a different attack type also being launched, and another one after that, and another one after that. And what that means is that the attackers are constantly changing their technique to evade the very people who are trying to mitigate and stop those attacks. So when you actually look at multiple attacks stacked up in the course of an actual incident, they tend to last more along the lines of 8 to 12 hours per individual incident than they do 30 minutes. So that's the real story behind the data. Now, if we look at Thailand as a whole, some big attacks recorded over the course of the past year. Okay? The largest attack happening back in July of 16 at 70 gigs. In February of 17, there was another that was 52 gigs. This is interesting just in terms of what is the size that we're bringing into Thailand in terms of attacks. But it's not really relevant all that much in terms of how impactful is it to you as an organization. Okay? What's actually more important to individual organizations is what is the average attack size. Okay? The average attack size is closer to about 850 megabits per second, roughly. Okay? Now, what is interesting about that is if you step back and you look at your organization and the amount of bandwidth that you procure, most organizations in Thailand have significantly less bandwidth than 800 megs. And so that means that the average attack is probably big enough to cause a service disruption for most of the organizations that are represented in this room today, on average. Okay? So whether the average attack size is 800 megs, whether it's 1.5 gigs, it almost doesn't matter. Unless you're a service provider who's buying the infrastructure to try to deal with it, then it matters. But for the average organization, it exceeds your internet capacity anyways. So it's technically going to be a problem. And it means that for you to solve it, you got to look further upstream. You can't look inside your own network as the sole source of resolving the issue. You got to look further upstream. Then what I think is really interesting is to go back to frequency is take a look at the chart on the bottom. That is representative of the number of DDoS attacks occurring in Thailand per calendar month. The month on the far right is March of 2017. So if you go from March back to April, or sorry, from March to February to January to December and then into November, you see a very disturbing growth trend, which is on average about 25% growth in the number of attacks month to month. Now think about that, extrapolate that over the course of a calendar year, and it's a pretty concerning picture. So what it kind of says is the problem is here and the problem is now. So while the average attack size is not growing significantly, the average attack size is big enough to be problematic. The frequency of attacks means that the problem is going to be brought to a much greater number of organizations than we've historically seen over the past few years. Now, the other chart that we have here is attack destination ports. And this question gets brought up a lot. People say, well, what services are being attacked? I need to know what services are being attacked. The funny thing is that in a way, you don't need to know what services are being attacked, because it really doesn't matter. Whether I'm launching an 800 megabit per second HTTP attack, or an 800 megabit per second SMTP attack, or an 800 megabit per second DNS attack, the end result is exactly the same if your internet connection is a 100 meg link. It doesn't matter what protocol is actually being attacked. Now, when you get into the complexities of how you mitigate attacks, such as, do I mitigate them in my content delivery network, in my CDN? Well, it might matter if that's an HTTP-based attack versus a different protocol. So it does make a difference in terms of how you mitigate. But in terms of the actual impact, an attack is an attack is an attack, regardless of what port it actually runs on when you're talking about volumetric attacks. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about IoT, we've talked about the botnets, we've talked about the motivations, and you've seen the actual data. So how do you deal with it? Now, there used to be some helpful pictures in these green boxes up there that would show you what these things meant, but my compression problem in PowerPoint took them away from me. So I apologize if the green boxes don't mean very much in this picture. But let me just take you through really quickly what each of these are supposed to refer to. All right, so the very first thing you should do is you need to start thinking about how do you factor the idea of availability into the design of your networks. And we always, when we build networks today, redundancy and BCP plans and all these things are a core part of how we build a network. But interestingly enough, a lot of organizations are still overlooking DDoS protection, DDoS detection, and DDoS mitigation in their overall designs. So this is something that we need to start looking at very seriously. When we build a data center, we put fire suppression systems in, okay? And those fire suppression systems cost a lot of money. Fires don't break out in data centers very often. When they do, they can be incredibly damaging. But DDoS attacks are now at a point where every organization has about a 50% chance of getting hit by an attack. And depending on your vertical, you've got potentially an even greater chance in the course of a calendar year. So somehow, some way, we got to start factoring mitigation of DDoS into all of our BCP plans, because they're an important part of resiliency, keeping the network up and running, protecting the brand reputation, and of course, trying to avoid financial losses associated with unwanted downtime. The second is to plan. Literally plan. Get in a conference room, sit around the table, and plan how are we going to deal with a DDoS attack when it happens. If it hasn't happened yet, it will happen statistically sometime in the future. So you need to know what to do. So the planning process really involves, looking at, okay, are we at a point where we feel we need to invest in a mitigation strategy? Do we know who in the organization is responsible for responding when an attack actually occurs? Do we know what we're going to do in terms of monitoring the network for other security problems when we're in the process of trying to mitigate? If we have multiple links, who's going to contact both of the service providers simultaneously to try to respond to this inbound attack, to ensure that we mitigate it as efficiently as we possibly can. And what are we going to do in terms of emergency budget if we didn't put anything in place? To pay money to someone to stop the attack. Do we have a plan to do that? Who's going to wake up the CFO at 3 o'clock in the morning to get that authorization to do that immediate spend so somebody can come on site, so your ISP can start mitigating the traffic for you as a service, etc. All of these things have to be thought about. If you don't plan ahead, the attack will be far more effective because you're going to spend all of your time scrambling, most likely at 3 o'clock in the morning on a holiday. And it's going to be really hard to get people together at that point in time. The next piece is to monitor. So we talk a lot about utilizing flow telemetry, and NetFlow has become a hugely critical asset for security organizations to better understand what's happening in their organization. Network monitoring analysis allows us to understand threats that are already inside the network. The days of I monitor my perimeter, I have a managed service provider to look at my perimeter IPS or my SIM, those days of being good enough are long behind us. APTs, attackers that have embedded themselves into the network, these are the kind of guys that we got to root out. We got to reduce their dwell time. One of the best ways to do it is to do behavioral analysis and statistical analysis against NetFlow-oriented data. And that's also a great vehicle for detecting abnormal network traffic, which equates to DDoS attacks in some cases. Then we've got multi-layer defense. So we talked about multiple types of DDoS attacks. We talked about there being application layer attacks, state exhaustion attacks, and volumetric attacks. If you have multiple attack types, you unfortunately cannot solve mitigating those attacks with a single solution. You have to have multiple layers of protection, kind of like that blooming onion type approach where you peel the layers back, right? So in this particular case, you need to have a solution on your own network to catch the real-time application layer and state exhaustion attacks, and you got to have a solution off your network to be able to do volumetric attacks for those attacks that are bigger than your intranet link. Then the other piece, guys, comes down to services. You have to work to close down services that you don't need and that are oftentimes used as reflection and amplification techniques. So that means open DNS resolvers, NTP servers, and these sorts of things. And beyond the technical controls, probably one of the most important things is to get active in the operational community. That means coordinating with Thai CERT. That means coordinating with your peers, your like peers in the same industry through formal information sharing relationships. We all have to help each other as a community to be more effective at resolving these problems. And then the last piece that I want to leave you with is we didn't talk anything about how to mitigate IoT attacks, okay? And we didn't do that on purpose. And I want to make sure everybody's clear, and we leave it at this today. IoT is an interesting topic because of how big the attacks are and how fast they can grow and how quickly the botnets can become these huge, monstrous things. But at the end of the day, an attack from an IoT botnet is exactly the same as an attack from a simplistic denial of service generating tool, one of those weaponized DDoS attack tools we talked about earlier. You mitigate them in exactly the same way that you mitigate any other DDoS attack, with multiple layers of defense, with planning, with forethought into your resiliency program, and coordination with the operational community. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you guys enjoy your lunch.
Thank you very much to Mr. Jason Hilling on such a great topic. Thank you, sir.